I've been baking a lot of bread recently. I don't know what started it. Maybe it was the challenge, because I've always heard that baking bread and sourdough is one of the hardest baking adventures, maybe one of the hardest forays you can go into. Like, there's already so many variables whenever you're cooking or baking, but whenever you're making bread, it's like so many more, because now you're working with an alive organism. So you're doing chemistry and biology. So it's kind of like biochemistry. However, we have been doing this for thousands of years as a species. We love bread, we love making it, and we figured out how to do it pretty well. So I know I said that it was pretty complicated to make bread, but we have been doing it for a while, and so we've kind of have this pretty well established basic foundation. Here is a bowl that they might have used in medieval times to mix their bread. And you can see some little crust and pieces of the bread that's stuck in there. You can imagine dried yeast living in there, and then every time you mix the next loaf and leave it to rise in that bowl, or maybe transfer it to another bowl, it rising with that yeast that inoculated it at the beginning. They were able to do this before they even knew about microbes or what yeast or leavening agents were. They just knew that if you use this bowl that you pass down through your family's generations, then you would have good bread that rose. With some very minimal upkeep for your starter, and with some very minimal investment, flour's pretty cheap per pound, you can have you some homemade, fresh, tasty, even partially more easy to digest. Like, sourdough is partially digested by the enzymes and bacteria in there. So if you're gluten intolerant, it's not going to take all of the gluten out, but it is definitely going to be a little bit better for your stomach. And a lot of people who, and this is purely anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt, but a lot of people who have gluten sensitivity find that sourdough is a little bit better on their stomach by leveraging kind of, I'm not going to say low effort, because it ends up being high effort whenever you stack it on top of each other, but by leveraging these minimal effort recipes, you could extend it to 10 loaves even in your home. Basically, you're only limited by the amount of doughs you can fit, or the amount of loaves that you can fit in the fridge, and your oven size. So I know I can only bake about 2 loaves at once, and our fridge always has quite a bit of stuff in it, so I don't think I could store more than a couple at a time. So this is a simple one, but it's made my life a lot easier. And so you always want to take notes. You always want to, I said, oh, this is lazy, but if you want to improve, of course, you can't be lazy. You have to be like a student to this, and that comes later with passion or whatever. So you want to use a stopwatch. So the moment that you throw your starter into your dough, you pull a stopwatch and just click start. It can be on your phone, it can be on like a physical watch that you have, but just something that's counting up the minutes and seconds and hours after a certain time. Rather than setting a 6-hour timer, it goes off and you forget to set another one, or you're in the middle of something, you don't hear it go off. You basically have a tally of how long your dough has been fermenting. You can, if your timer has a lap function, you can even keep the same timer going and lap it whenever you do the different steps in the process of making your dough. So I call that the lazy timer method, but it's literally just a stopwatch. You can set timers. I set timers as well, but it's nice to see a running tally. Oh, okay, my dough has been going for about 9 hours. Okay, and a couple tips I wanted to add for baking is, number one, if the bottom is over browning, so I struggled with this with a few of my loaves at the beginning. The bottom was getting, the top was developing a nice crispy crust, and the bottom was like black, so I had to cut off some of the bottom. And that could be a combination of things. My oven is just pretty hot on the bottom. So if you have another tray, you can put, there's the inverted tray on the top to keep the steam down, but you can put another tray on the bottom to act as like a heat shield. So you want to put that in right when you put the loaf in. You don't want to preheat it, or it'll just be as hot as everything else is in your oven. But the idea is maybe that's going to absorb and then have to re-emit the heat from it, so the heat doesn't just directly hit the bottom of your loaf. It might take it a little bit longer to brown, and then you can get a darker top, tastier crust. So you want to choose a temperature, and this can be found however you want, but you just experiment with what to preheat your oven to. So I choose anywhere from 430 to about 450. So if you spend any time and get to know me, you'll find that I'm kind of forgetful. I remember the important things, but I am a bit forgetful, and I struggle with routine. I hate routine. And a lot of the websites and recipes you'll see is you have to have a strict baking routine. Each recipe will sometimes be given to you as a routine to follow. Oh yeah, start this 12 hours before. But the thing is, with the temperature and your starter and even the percentage of starter that you're using, relying just on a time is not enough. And actually, there are easier ways to do it. You think, oh, just relying on a timer is pretty easy. But is it easy if it gives you pretty inconsistent results? I wouldn't call that easy. Maybe it's an easy process, but it doesn't feel easy whenever your loaves keep failing and you're just paying attention to the time. Your bulk, so that's like anywhere from 5 to 6 to 12 to 10 hours, and then after that you shape, which is a tough process with a high skill ceiling, but it's easy to get the basics of. And then your proofing can last anywhere from 20% of that time, so maybe 1 to 2 hours, to overnight. You just pop it in the fridge and you'll get a little proofing, and then depending on the temperature of your fridge, it will continue to roll over a little bit in the fridge. So you can refrigerate it indefinitely until you're ready to bake it, as long as it's been minimum overnight, maybe like eight or so hours, and the dough isn't frozen. Okay, so we talked about the lazy starter schedule, so now let's go over the lazy math. So I call this lazy math. I would argue that any amount of math isn't lazy, but you can be lazy in how you do math. So they're what's called, we use whenever we're baking bread, we use what's called baker's percentages or baker's math. We hear a lot of that, but basically what you're doing is saying what percent of the flour that I'm adding to this recipe are all of the ingredients. So you could think of it as a relative scale. It's not necessarily a scale. It's like it's a conversion, and it's not percent of solution. So say you're doing this is a small, really small, unrealistic batch, but this just makes the numbers easy to work with. Say you're doing 100 grams of flour and you want a 65% hydration dough. 65 grams. So you multiply 100 by 0.65, you get 65. So okay, I had 65 grams of water. This is a small, really small, unrealistic batch, but this just makes the numbers easy to work with. Say you're doing 100 grams of flour and you want a 65% hydration dough. 65 grams, so you multiply 100 by 0.65, you get 65. So, okay, I had 65 grams of water, but what's your total dough's weight? Well, it's 65 plus 100 plus however much salt you add, plus however much starter you add, right? So it's not percent of solution. I know maybe if you're familiar with chemistry, or if you've done maybe some math with pool liquid additions, that might come up. But we always do percent of the flour that you're going. So salt's anywhere from 2 to 3%. You won't probably taste the difference, but don't push it higher than that. The water heavily depends on your flour, so we'll get into that later. But the water is anywhere from 50 to 80%, so that's just 0.5, percent. So percent means out of 100 cent, out of 100. So yeah, that's kind of your basic baker's math. I'll show a little bit of a graphic here. You can pause. But yep, that is how I do all my recipes, especially if you're going for low minimal effort. You don't even have to write anything down. You get your phone's calculator, or you try to work out the numbers and have it pretty simple. You can just say, oh yeah, today I'm going to bake a 65% hydration. So you just, oh, okay, I have 300 grams of flour. Okay, 0.65 times 300. And then, you just multiply, you get all your weights that you need, you add everything together, and then you basically are doing it like a running tally of weight. You're just adding things sequentially in the bowl. And I've not found that adding your ingredients in any order, like some people will talk about an autolysis, like allowing the enzymes in the flour to kind of break it down before you add the starter or salt. But I just tend to add all of my ingredients and do a bit of a kneading at the beginning until the dough is kind of a little bit stiff, and then allowing it to relax, you know. So I just throw all my ingredients in. So this really helps you minimize the effort. You don't have to, you know, have an extensive recipe. You don't have to do all of this nonsense, you know, all this extensive planning, you know. Like, I suffer a little bit from what I would call like analysis paralysis. So sometimes if there's like a long list of steps that I have to accomplish, it's hard to do step one because I know that locks me into step two and then step three. So knowing that you can kind of do this in a pretty hands-off, very lax approach is encouraging, and it might actually inspire a lot of you to bake yourselves. If you want your dough to have a nice crispy crust but also get this tall oven spring that actually will give you a bit more height in your loaf, then you want there to be plenty of water, plenty of steam inside your actual oven. So I struggle with this because mine is convection on always oven, so it's pretty much blowing the steam out, but I combat this by trying to have more water in there. So basically, when you're preheating, you want to put a dish in the bottom that has a little bit of water in it, so that begins to boil and release steam when you put your loaf in there immediately after. So the water is preheating in the bottom of your oven, and then once it gets to temp, you want to take your loaf, either flip it out of its banneton or however you've been proofing it, take it out of the fridge, put it in the oven, and then immediately put what they call an inverted tray or inverted baking dish. So that will go on a rack on top. So above, so I'll have kind of like a half graphic of what it looks like. But you'll basically just have this inverted tray so that you'll get these little circulations of steam that stay in this area, so that it's kind of crisping and adding to that crust texture, and keeps the steam from also just immediately evaporating or being blown out of your oven as well. And also, I mentioned, so right before you close it, so you put that in there, you put the inverted tray on top, and then you pour water in the bottom, so you actually top up that, you know. So it was preheating, the tray was preheating with water, and when you add more water to it, that gives it more to boil in the first many minutes. So I've experimented, but I've been doing about 20 to 30 minutes you do not under any circumstances want to open your oven after you've got all the steam and your loaf and the inverted tray in there, because you're basically kicking yourself in the foot. You don't want to open it up and spritz more water, or I say kicking yourself, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. You don't want to spritz more water or anything because you're releasing steam and heat. So basically, once you put the loaf in there and once you add more water to that bottom baking dish that's going to be steaming and releasing steam as you bake, you want to just set it and forget it. Okay, sorry for the wet hair, by the way. It's raining outside. You can't hear it as much, but I had to go close a couple doors and stuff, so I kind of got soaked a little bit. But this is a different shirt, so I'm not completely fully soaked. Okay, anyways, we start. So I want to call this the lazy method. So Jagger's lazy tech, if you would, lazy sourdough tech. Okay, so to get the lazy starter schedule, I like to just start with the key things, and then you can do everything else optionally after that. So the key thing is waiting till about 7 days or longer before your starter has established before you bake, and using whole wheat to begin your starter, right? So what is a starter? The starter has your bacteria and yeast. They come together from what's residual on the outside of the grain when it's harvested in the wild. So I know they wash it, and even in white flour they bleach it and grind it down, but that doesn't take everything away. There's still little spores and things attached to it, and ultimately, if you cultivate those for about a couple weeks, there will be a couple strains or species that dominate, and then you will have a healthy starter that you can bake bread with. And then you can manage the acidity and stiffness, and basically just by how much water that you add to it. But a lot of recipes will tell you a strict, you need to do 1-to-1, or you need to add 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water every 2 days. Every 2 days, discard. I found that you don't have to discard at all. If your starter is smelling a little bit sour, so the bacteria kind of can build up and release a lot of acid. You can kind of start to smell that and maybe even taste that. Your loaves are a little bit sour. You can discard, but a lot of times, especially when you're building up that loaf, you're not going to be baking with it, and you'll be monitoring the amount of like liquid that appears on the top. But in the beginning, you don't need to discard at all. Just feed whenever water begins to pool. I'll show up a picture of this is what hungry starter looks like. This is what starter that's rising looks like. And this is what starter that's just began. So it'll just literally look like a mixed jar. So after you get a little bit of bubbles, you may think by day 3 or 4 that your starter is ready, but sometimes I actually experience this. They'll call it like a false rise. So it'll look like it's doing amazing, but this is just even some of the yeast competing, and bacteria, maybe even some bacteria producing some gas, competing for different resources in there before the colony has fully settled out. So it will actually look like it's ready to bake with, but whenever you bake with it, it'll either not rise how you want it, or it could even contain some funky tasting bacteria. So I would set in your calendar at least a week, but preferably maybe 2 weeks, and then you can just start developing strength. But my starter is several months old now that I've made from scratch with some whole wheat and white starter, and it is doing great. It's very strong. I can go at least 4 days without feeding, and longer if I put it in the fridge. So yeah, just a little tidbit, I guess, on storage. You want to, especially when your starter's young, you want to try to feed it consistently at least once a day. So I showed you what hungry starter looks like. So just kind of eyeball an amount of flour and amount of water. Try to keep it a similar texture. Maybe if you're planning on baking the following day, add a little bit more flour. Or if you're planning on, maybe you're planning on going out of town, so you maybe want to feed a little bit less, and then you might refrigerate. And then refrigeration. So as long as your refrigerator isn't freezing, so if it's anything above 32, you're going to be able to pop your sourdough covered. It'll dry out if you don't, but you'll be able to pop your starter in the fridge, and it'll really slow down its metabolism, so how fast it's actually going through its food. And you can extend the shelf life and life of it. So if there's ever a couple weeks where I'm going to be gone or something, I'll just feed it a little bit and pop it in there. And yeah, so the hungry starter, that little layer of water on top, you can mix that in or you can pour it off. I've seen either way. Maybe if you don't want to discard, you can discard that. I'm not sure. I need to read into that more or do some more experimentation. I'm just going to finish this out by showing a couple of the cool loaves and some pizza that I've made. If you want to watch any other videos on my channel, I only have one so far, but I plan to record some more soon about food and other things that I'm interested in, so I hope you enjoyed.